Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Alex Cooley. I'm the director of the Harriman Institute here at Columbia University, and on behalf of Harriman and the Center on Global Energy Policy at SIPA, it's my great pleasure to welcome you to today's special event, a Columbia Energy Dialogue event on sanctions, Ukraine, and energy markets. And this is an extremely timely topic. I think the context keeps changing, and so we keep trying to keep up with events in the world and provide some sort of analytical perspective. We are really lucky. We have a very impressive and knowledgeable panel here today that have gathered to discuss and bring their different perspectives on the topic of sanctions, the Ukrainian crisis. I think maybe Syria will come up too. So let me just quickly introduce them. First will be Simon de Galbert. He is currently a visiting fellow at the Europe program for the Center for Strategic and International Studies, CSIS, in Washington, D.C. He's actually also a diplomat, taking, I think, a 2-year leave to be at CSIS. So welcome, Simon. He's going to provide some of the European perspective on the sanctions debate and the sanctions regime. Next will be Richard Nephew. Richard's a fellow and program director on economic statecraft, sanctions, and energy markets here at the Center on Global Energy Policy. You might have recognized him. He's incredibly prolific, and he's become just one of the main authoritative voice on the sanctions regime. He brings, I think, a wealth of experience in the policy world, actually crafting these and thinking about them very carefully, but not also to our world, the analytical and academic world, and we're really grateful to be cooperating with him on another event. And then very happy to announce William Harriman at the end there. He's senior advisor to the Energy Secretary, Department of Energy, and I understand he spent July in Kiev. So I don't know if we're going to get the report there, but he'll be providing some context and some commentary from the current policymaking perspective on some of these remarks. So the format is Simone and Richard will spend about 10 to 12 minutes giving their remarks and thoughts. Then Bill will offer some commentary. We'll do some pointed questions and answers, and then we'll open it up to the group. I'll just remind everyone this is on the record. It's being live streamed, so you're part of the discussion too, if you would like to be. And Simone, I invite you to kick things off with the European perspective on what's going on in Ukraine.
Thanks very much, Alex. And hello to everyone. I'm very happy to be here. I will try to give you a few thoughts, 5 thoughts that I think are important to bear in mind when talking about sanctions and the Ukraine crisis, and I look forward to discuss them with you. The first point I think that we have to keep in mind is how politically the sanctions were important in keeping Europeans together and keeping the Europeans and the United States together. When you think about the situation in 2014, when the crisis in Ukraine started, the European debate was somehow divided into 3 groups of countries. You had on one hand a country mostly composed of Eastern member states and a few other Nordic countries, which were having an interpretation of the Ukraine crisis as a structural shift in the European history, and one that needed to move towards more isolation from Russia. And so in that sense, in that narrative, sanctions were obviously the first step towards more isolation and more protection. On the other hand, you had another group in Central Europe, a group of countries that were very much more skeptical about the need and justification for sanctions, and who also entertain much more significant economic relations with Russia. And I think in the middle you found countries in the West, like Germany and France, who ended up leading the negotiating format, the so-called Normandy format with Ukraine and Russia, and which defended a position according to which what Russia was doing in Ukraine was in no way acceptable, and that Europe could not accept that as a fait accompli. But that on the other hand, it was not in a long-term European interest to isolate itself from Russia. And that's how they were able to build consensus within the European Union towards the sanctions regime that have been put in place, a targeted and surgical sanctions regime. And they also were able, with the United States, to build a common understanding of what was necessary in the different stages of the crisis from February to the summer of 14. But so even if countries in Europe, and also I think to a certain extent in the United States, didn't come up with the same analysis of what the crisis in Ukraine meant for Europe long term, sanctions managed to bring them together to build a coherent response to the Russian strategy. And I think to a large extent this came as a surprise for Russia, who I think did not bet that Europeans would find the strength to align in a common positions to impose a cost on Russia. So that's I would say the first benefit of sanctions, this unification factor. The second point, which is very important to bear in mind, is that I think sanctions have had a strong economic impact on Russia, but have also had a stronger economic impact on Europe than on the United States. And that those are two very different considerations. The first one, there has been a lot of debate about what exact role sanctions have played in the recession that Russia has been going through for the past couple of years and still is going through today. I think the Russians have faced somehow some kind of a perfect storm which combined the lack of structural reforms that they had been implemented, the structural weaknesses of their economy, obviously a conjunctural decrease of oil prices and of commodities prices in general. And I think the sanctions compounded the effects of the two previous factors and added a layer of difficulties for the Russian economy. So I'm not saying that without sanctions Russia would be facing a 4% GDP increase today. They would be in a difficult situation, but I think sanctions aggravated things, and to an extent that proved problematic for the Russian economy, especially when it comes down to foreign exchange reserves, for instance. And you have to remember at some point that just before the Minsk II agreement, for instance, many people were actually worried that the Russian economy would simply collapse, and were worried about the consequences that sanctions may have in this collapse and how it would in turn impact global markets, both Europe and the United States. So that's one thing. Then you also have to bear in mind a fact that is sometimes a little bit underappreciated here in the United States, which is the fact that sanctions cost Europeans much more than they cost the United States. To a certain extent, this is justifiable because what happened in Ukraine happens in Europe. And so Europeans should be the first to be concerned with this situation and the first to make the efforts to face this situation. But this has also political implications. European Union, Russia trade before the sanctions was 10 times higher than what it was between the United States and Europe. And Germany itself, German trade with Russia was 2 times higher than the US trade, US-Russia trade. So considering the fact that European trade with Russia should decline by about 30% in 2015, when you are talking about a starting position of more than 300 billion euros of trade, you are talking about a significant amount of money. And the impact is not only in trade, but also in more financial issues. The European Commission, I think, has estimated last year that sanctions would cost Europe about 0.3 point of GDP. And considering the fact that Europe is not isn't facing a very high period of economic growth, 0.3 isn't much, but relatively it's significant. So that's the second point. The third point, which I think goes at the core of what sanctions are supposed to do, is that, in my view, and that's something we have also wrote together with Richard, so I don't think that you're going to face a lot of disagreements on this, sanctions have had an impact at the tactical level, but not at the strategic level. And what I mean by saying that is that I think the Russian objective in Ukraine has been basically to ensure an ability to influence the future decision-making process of Ukraine. And the way they have managed to do that in the early stages of the crisis has been through military means. And I think the way they are trying to achieve that now is through more political means, which is a very different situation. And I think this objective, strategically speaking, hasn't changed much. And when you look at other instances of international sanctions, Iran being the most obvious one that can come to our minds, sanctions have also in that case impacted the way the Iranians were looking at developing their nuclear capacities, but it hasn't really changed the Iranian objective to retain strategically an ability to produce nuclear fissile materials at some point, even if with increasing constraints thanks to the Joint Comprehensive Plan of Action. So sanctions act as a tactical level and have played, I think, a significant role in pushing the Russians towards negotiation rather than confrontation, if only for the benefit of avoiding further sanctions, which at some point, if you remember, in February 15, before the Minsk II agreement, were very much on the table, as well as other options, by the way, more military-related options. Now, if you think about the future of sanctions, I think, as you were well aware of, we are now in a more stable situation with the security parameters on the ground having improved in the past few weeks. There has been agreements for the removal of weapons from the line of control. And there has also been some progress on the political side of things, especially this week with the postponement of local election in rebel-held regions. So that's positive in a way. The problem here is that nobody really agrees on the reasons why this situation is actually more stable. And that's a very significant factor as to the way we think about the future of sanctions. Some are arguing that this calmer situation derives from the fact that Russia thinks to be able to achieve its strategic objective through more peaceful means, through political influence and political clout within Ukraine. Some believe that it might just be a tactical trick to make sure that the Europeans don't renew their sanctions in January 16, when they are due to expire. Others think that this is related to the Syrian crisis and the fact that Russia might need calm in Ukraine while it is proceeding with another tricky strategy in Syria. It's very difficult to know. What matters the most is that I think we keep insisting on the full implementation of the Minsk agreement of February 15, which is the only diplomatic framework on the table and the really realistic one right now. Having said that, and looking perhaps very quickly to the possible scenarios that we may be facing in Europe in January 16, when the sanctions are due to expire. From the conclusions of the Normandy Format Summit meeting last week in Paris, we have no certainty that the Minsk agreement will not be fully implemented by the end of 2015, as it was initially supposed to be. And so the question will be posed to the Europeans: what will they do? And there are several scenarios possible. I think that the groups that I mentioned earlier are going to be a relevant group of countries to analyze, and other factors might weigh in, such as the other crises Europeans are going through, such as the refugees crisis, for instance. But I think in a situation where the security situation on the ground was as it is right now, which is calmer, but the political parameters of Minsk and the ultimate one, which is Ukraine regaining control of its border. I think that Europeans should be able to preserve the architecture of the sanctions in place, and they should do so until Minsk would be fully implemented. I could not exclude that if the situation remains better, there might be some appetite for politically signaling to the Russians that because the situation is better, the Europeans might be willing to do something to perhaps very minimally alleviate the pressure. But that would need to be agreed upon Europeans, and also I think it would be a complicated discussions here in the United States, where I think the vision about Russia and beyond the Ukraine crisis is also changing bit by bit. If the situation again gets into a more difficult territory with more ceasefire violations, I think we will be in a situation where Europeans should roll over their sanctions more easily, and perhaps even more if really the situation collapses and Minsk agreement not being relevant anymore, envision perhaps ways to increase pressure on the Russians. But that would be also a pretty difficult discussion. So let me end there, and I'll look forward to your questions.
Thanks very much, Simone. Let's go to Richard. And before we do, let me just remind everyone that Simone and Richard have written this article for the national interest, which I should have mentioned in my introduction, Why Sanctions Against Russia Can Still Make a Difference, and we do have copies of it at the entrance table. Richard.
Thank you very much, and thanks everybody for being here. Thanks to everybody who's watching online now or will be watching at some point in the future. I really appreciate the opportunity. I think Simone did a great job, and I think teeing up a lot of really critical issues. And I think, as you said, we're not going to disagree on a number of these things. What I'd like to do is really kind of focus on where things could potentially go from here, especially if we needed to look for new ways of ratcheting up the pressure on Putin and on Russia. And I think, going back to a point Simone mentioned, to me it is unarguable that the sanctions have had an effect on the Russian economy. I think they took advantage of a time of economic weakness in Russia, both systemically and then with what happened in the oil markets. And that was something nobody could have predicted. But the sanctions themselves were very effective in targeting another one of Russia's vulnerabilities, and that is its dependence on credit lines. And basically, Russia faced a situation where it could either take out more money through credit, or it can make more money through oil sales, and all of a sudden, in around September of 2014, both of those options were clamped off. And I think the result has been major increase in pressure on the Russian economy. But thus far, we've not seen that have a change or create a change in the overall strategy of President Putin. I do think that it was partly responsible for his readiness to move to a ceasefire in Minsk II. And I think it was part of his thinking that he needed to have a break from additional sanctions pressure. As Simone mentioned, there was a lot of discussion at the time about ratcheting up the pressure on the Russians, and there was fear in a lot of quarters that the Russian economy could be permanently destabilized as a result of all this. But the upshot is that I think while Putin sees and has to deal with the consequences of economic instability, and as any Russian who lived through the 80s and 90s, I think he's acutely aware of what economic instability potentially could do to the political system in Russia, I think ultimately through a combination of his dismissal of economic pressure as being as significant as other forms of pressure, like military pressure, for instance, as well as the fact that Crimea itself and some degree of control over eastern Ukraine are so important from a strategic perspective, makes him to some degree inured to what we can bring from an economic perspective. That doesn't mean that there won't still be a role for additional economic sanctions, but I do think it means that we have to consider carefully what our objectives are in doing so. So to take this point, when we started the sanctions campaign, way back in December of 2013, it was about dealing with Russian involvement in instability in Ukraine. Then it evolved to being about Crimea and Russian occupation of Crimea. Then it evolved to being Russian involvement in eastern Ukraine in a fairly destabilizing fashion. The objectives of the sanctions started shifting to address a broader set of Russian bad behaviors. But at the same time, I think the Russians made more and more strategic value, or attached more and more strategic value to things like Crimea. And even if he didn't intend in the first instance to snatch Crimea, the fact that he did means that Putin now is in a pretty tough spot. He can't possibly give it back. And he can't give it back for a lot of domestic political reasons. He can't give it back for a lot of international reasons. And he can't give it back because I don't think it's in his nature to. But we have already made a condition of resolution of the sanctions issue, resolution of the Crimea issue. And so to me, there is now a very critical question of what is the purpose behind sanctions? What is the intention behind sanctions? What's the purpose and intention behind the entire European and U.S., Ukraine, and Russia policy? And I think that ultimately there are going to be some parts that are going to stick, but there are going to be some parts that are potentially going to shift, particularly depending on what the reactions are coming out of Kyiv. So let us, for instance, posit a scenario in which the Ukrainian government is looking for resolution of the crisis because continued stalemate going years and years and years is having a damaging impact on the Ukrainian economy, on political stability, so on and so forth. If the Ukrainian government were to come forward and say, all right, here's the accommodation we can live with, then I think the United States and the European Union will go along with that, whatever the dimensions that might contain. If, on the other hand, there's continued instability and political discomfort in Ukraine with any kind of accommodation to Russian proclaimed interests in the country, and by the way, I can understand why that would be the case, but that does mean that there is a possibility of more protracted conflict here, because then there are no easy way outs. I mean, I think the unfortunate scenario here is not that this is a conflict over a disputed border. This is about Russian involvement in what was a pretty clear international border, and certainly one that the Ukrainian government felt quite strongly about. So if there is going to be any kind of accommodation or negotiated settlement, it's going to first off have to revolve around changes in how Ukraine sees the situation itself, and then there's going to have to be acceptance of something suboptimal, I think, from the perspective of the United States and the European Union. And that's hard, and that's complicated. And I think, as Assistant Secretary Nuland of the State Department said just a couple days ago, Crimea sanctions will remain in place until Crimea is resolved. It speaks to the underlying concerns about shifting on the objectives, even as I think any kind of diplomatic settlement is going to require some of that. Well, what does that mean going forward? Well, it's possible that Minsk II is going to be fully implemented, and that all of its provisions are going to be undertaken, and that the problem will be resolved as a result of that. I don't think that's terribly likely. And I think that there is enough indication already in terms of shifting goalposts on deadlines and when this is all supposed to be done, as well as the fact that a lot of the things that were agreed to in Minsk II are pretty significant for all sides, that it as an agreement probably will not stand in its own right, and that more negotiations are going to be required to get to something that is a final resolution of the problem. That's not likely to happen anytime soon. And I think there's still a question about whether or not Putin is under enough pressure to make some accommodations to the Ukrainians in this regard. From that perspective, I think that it's entirely plausible to think that additional sanctions pressure is going to be considered. Now, that's going to come not only through extension of current sanctions and making sure those are in place, as well as more robust enforcement of those sanctions, which I think needs to happen, potentially even though consideration of sanctions that go beyond that. Now, I've written about the possibility of sanctions expanding to include a reduction in Russian crude oil exports. And I think that that is something that is actually plausible. It's plausible both in the context of international oil markets, it's plausible in the context of international oil prices, and it's plausible in that the Russian economy is basically balanced on a knife's edge at this point. It wouldn't take too much lost export revenues in order to create some real risks there to its ability to manage, its ability to pay for its import bill, and its ability to fund all the activities that it wants to fund, which, by the way, now includes a new commitment in Syria. And I think that is actually important to think of in the context of sanctions implementation. The upshot is that that is a potential point of leverage. But I think everybody would rightly point out the risk of energy supplies being disrupted as a result to Europe in particular. And a lot of people would point to natural gas as being the case in point here. Now, I'll say I don't personally believe the Russians have a whole lot of interest in cutting off natural gas exports to Europe or to Ukraine. I think that they'll talk a big game, and I think that in the past they've certainly done so because it was both strategically possible and tactically convenient. But today, that is not the case. they would stand to lose significantly if they lost the export revenues attached to those natural gas exports. And if they would be damaged by a 5 to 10 to 15% reduction in crude oil exports, imagine the damage of losing all that money that they are currently gaining from natural gas exports to Europe and to Ukraine. And I think that if you're a Russian decision maker, you've got to think very carefully about pulling that trigger. It's part of the reason why I think that earlier this week they concluded all the negotiations they needed to conclude about the supply of natural gas into Europe through March of 2016, right through the cold winter months of Europe. So I think that's potentially overblown. But I do suspect that that's easy for me to say in my ivory tower up here in Colombia, and much harder to say if I were a European policymaker. So I think additional sanctions that will probably be contemplated first include things like toughening the amount of technology that's going to be permitted to be exported to Russia, particularly in its oil and gas sector, clamping down on its financial access, clamping down on other aspects of trade, and potentially more personal designations and trying to seize the assets of particular individuals of note. But I do think that if the situation is not resolved soon, there's going to be a critical decision point reached in the United States and in Europe, and hopefully with the two of them acting in concert. And that is whether or not the current situation is satisfactory or whether or not more is needed. And I think in that scenario, it would be very difficult for anyone who believes the current situation is unacceptable not to pursue additional forms of pressure. In terms of timelines, I think that that could happen relatively soon, particularly because you can see sometime in early 2016, Iranian oil supplies coming back online, particularly as we see the Syria conflict getting potentially worse. And I think I can imagine in question and answer we might have some conversation about Syria too. But I think that there are lots of reasons to believe that not anytime soon will there be relief granted to the Russian economy, and certainly there'll be ways and options considered and potentially even pursued to put more pressure on it for all these various different concerns that we have. Thank you.
Super. Thank you, Richard. And now Bill will offer us the perspective from Washington.
Okay, thanks, Alex. And I know you've had enough federal visitors here that you already know that I'm speaking for myself and not for the U.S. government what I say. So these are my opinions. And I'm really delighted that you asked me to come here and respond on Simone's and Richard's comments. They were very informative and thought-provoking, I think. And I'll tell you a little bit about the mission I was on and then go into the remarks. Basically, in 2014, President Poroshenko, in visiting the U.S., asked for assistance on energy technical assistance in preparing for last winter. And Secretary Moniz agreed to send a small team, and we also, to give an idea of the difference in the team a year ago, the FEMA group was probably the biggest group, so Emergency Management Administration, and the Red Cross was part of the group, and then there were a few of us from DOE headquarters and a few from the national labs, and a contingent from Canada. This year, the Red Cross, so we went over again this summer at the request. Basically, we helped put together very quickly a plan for last winter, and it provided some help. It got various ministries communicating. There are a lot of skills that FEMA brought to an emergency situation. They knew who needed to start talking with one another and made those things happen. The request for us to come back came from the Prime Minister, and it involved, if you will, drilling down deeper on the energy technical assistance. And the second time, it was DOE headquarters, Canada, and the European Commission sent a group of technical experts as well. So it was a very nice opportunity for us all to work together. And you may not be aware, but Canada has special interest with Ukraine from about 5% of the Canadian citizens have backgrounds from Ukraine. So that was the connection there, and they made a very major commitment, relatively speaking. So there were two tasks this last summer. One was work on more detail for what to do for the winter. It involved gas and storage and the reverse flows and how to think through the scenarios with Russia, and then district heating, which through years of deferred maintenance is just a real maintenance mess, and then the electrical systems, which of course have both just your traditional problems and the special challenges with the importance of nuclear in Ukraine as well. So that was what we were doing there, and we worked for a month with Ukraine officials from the government for the most part. Striking differences for me in the two trips were a year ago there were almost every day there was a patriotic parade and great fervor. This last year I'd say there were to the extent there were public demonstrations, they were less focused on particular patriotic issues and more the issues of a democracy, if you will. I would say the biggest ones were complaints from the coffee trucks about how they got their permits and so forth. So in a way, I think that was progress, that it was getting on to the business of a regular country. I also noticed, though, as has been mentioned, real change in the resolvedness of the Ukrainian citizens. I think Simone mentioned that Russia will have an effect on what happens in Ukraine. I think it's an example of be careful what you wish for, you might get it, because they definitely are affecting it, but I think they've created more of an anti-Russian unified attitude in Ukraine than there was before. And that is one important element of how things have changed there. I think that the point about the sanctions being a greater sacrifice for Europe than for the US is very important for us to keep in mind. And it's something that should be brought up early and often, I guess. And I would say I think Ukraine hasn't quite explained itself as well as it needs to. It was only after several conversations that it started to hit me. I mean, one of Ukraine's biggest problems, I think, with Western Europe is the fact that the first impression on this matter was Ukraine taking gas destined for other countries because they were having an argument with Russia. And that created a bad initial impression and a bad framework to move forward from. When you talk with Ukrainians and learn that in their minds, well, we lost at least as much gas in Crimea and in the conflict zone, and we have to get it. This is where it is. It goes back to the two most famous New Yorkers on remarks, I think, are Yogi Berra and Willie Sutton, and this is Willie Sutton was, why do you rob banks? That's where the money is. And here, why would you take gas from the transit pipeline? Because that was the only place they could get it. I think that the biggest danger over the next winter would be there's some gas in Ukrainian storage, enough perhaps for a mild winter, perhaps not enough for a cold winter. And depending, hopefully the return of Russian supply can make everything work. But if somebody wants to pull the chain again, that will be one real danger there. And I just hope that when we talk about the future of sanctions, in my mind, and I look at what Russia has done as we see the sanctions having a negative effect on them, I hope that we can all find a way to direct that pride of both the Russian government and the Russian people in a more positive direction and not keep painting corners that create this lashing out. And just I'll let it go at that.
Super, thanks very much. So let me pose some questions to you all. First, Simone, I want to bring in the Syria dimension here, inevitably. And from the perspective, and we talked about this in earlier sessions, that there are really a lot of levels to the Ukrainian conflict. One is this kind of local civil war level with the separatists and their ideas and beliefs. Of course, the second is this kind of Russian-Ukrainian level. That's the level that we focus on usually in the West, this violation of Ukrainian sovereignty, annexation of Crimea, intervention in the Donbass, support for the rebels, and the denial by the Russian government that they're doing it, right? In part because really it is such a taboo and affront to international law and norms. But there's also this international level, and I think that's the level that the Russians really want to play at when it comes to the Ukraine conflict, right? That it's about spheres of influence, it's about the incursion of the West, it's about NATO expansion, it's about Kosovo, it's about all these things aside from Ukraine. Well, now with the Syria conflict, I think we're seeing more of that international dimension, right? And whether it's to change the conversation, whether it's to assert themselves as a traditional Middle Eastern power, whether it's an attempt to shore up the Iran Syria axis in the Middle East, or to just preserve a client in the regime. For whatever reason, Russia is now intervening and changing facts on the ground. So my question to you, is, the sanctions regime is created very much with a view on the second level, right? There's this clear expectation, benchmarks about Minsk II, and the sides adhering to it, and progress being made. And these are going to be sort of the standards that we use to lift the sanctions regime. It seems to me, though, given current circumstances, and this is where I think the refugee crisis comes in, that there will be every temptation in certain European capitals to link the two, right? And so I'm wondering, what are your thoughts on that, on keeping, on the European side, focused on what's going on in Ukraine and actually trying to decouple from the temptation of doing some grand bargain with Russia over Ukraine and Syria and all these other matters?
Thanks, Alex. Well, that's quite a question. I think there are several layers, as you said. The first layer is, I mentioned earlier the possibility that the situation in Ukraine was calmer somehow because Russia needed calm in Ukraine to have its hands freer in Syria. I tend to believe that things aren't so well orchestrated. I think that the Russian intervention in Syria is really related to the situation on the ground in Syria, where Moscow's ally, President Assad, was facing a very difficult time, and that the help that was provided to him by some other allies in the region was not sufficient anymore to held territory. And so I think the Russian intervention is very much related to this reality on the ground in Syria, but this Syrian reality, not so much a direct link with the situation in Ukraine. Then you can debate the reason why you need to support this ally and the strategic reasons behind that, but that's another topic, and it's not related to Ukraine. Another layer is, as you said, the links that some in Europe are seeing between the need for more cooperation with Russia and the fact that whatever we do, we cannot deal with international crises, whether in Ukraine or in Syria, with putting Russia aside. And the fact that, and the risk that some Europeans could see, could see President Putin being a solution along with what he recommends, which is an alliance with President Assad against all terrorists in Syria, which is a different vision than the one we have, and the fact that Russia could actually be the solution to European problems related to Syria, i.e. the flow of refugees or the terrorist threat and so on. I think that risk was very much existing maybe a week ago. Things change very fast. I think this risk is a little bit less relevant today because everyone is seeing that actually Russia isn't intervening in Syria against Daesh, which is the target of the Western military strikes in Syria, but rather with the simple objective to help its ally, the Assad regime, against all its enemies. And so I think the risk of seeing Europeans making a link between cooperation with Russia and Syria that would justify being softer with the Russians on Ukraine may be less relevant now that the objectives of President Putin in Syria are becoming clearer. But it could change. The last thing that I think we need to be very careful about is to avoid, you said that sanctions were very much related to the second point that you mentioned, which was Ukraine. And I think we need to be very careful not to change that. I think sanctions must be targeted at behavior, and so we need to stick with sanctions tackling Russian behavior in Ukraine, not sanctions being a tool to address Russia or what Russia has become elsewhere and beyond. I don't think sanctions are the right tool to address the concerns that we may have with Russia's intervention in Syria. And I think we would be in trouble, transatlantically speaking, to agree on such expansion of the objectives of Russia sanctions. So there are many different layers, but I think those are the three most significant.
Thanks. So Richard, feel free to weigh in on that. I also have a tough question for you, since you are the resident expert. Yeah, that was the easy one, yeah. And the tough question just concerns about how you think about sanctions and then how you draw them up and then some of their intended and unintended consequences. And one of the, we have these interesting surveys that come out. I'm not sure how much stock you can put in them, but they're interesting for fostering discussion. And one of them, latest one from Pew, was on the state of the Russian economy, right? And 70% of respondents in Russia said they have a negative perception of the economy. The same poll, 7 out of 10 respondents said they approved of the way President Putin was handling the economy, right? This is very similar actually to the polling that you see in Central Asia, right? Do you approve of Russian leadership? Overwhelmingly approve of Russian leadership, even though arguably the crisis and the counter-sanctions and the collapse of the ruble have just initiated another financial economic crisis in Central Asia. So it's this kind of paradox of instability and then the protector against instability that comes out. And I'm wondering, is this something that you sort of thought about when you were creating sanctions? How did you try and think about the unknowns, as Donald Rumsfeld would have said, and this sort of very quirky particularities of Russian political culture and behavior?
Sure. No, it's a tough question, but it's right in the wheelhouse, right in the strike zone. So, look, I would say a couple things. I mean, first, I would look at the question of the polling data with at least a bit of a jaundiced eye. I mean, you know better than me, but the degree to which one can say, I think everything's awful, but it's definitely not the guy who can have me arrested fault, right. I think ought to bear in at some point. And I think we've seen same kind of things in other sanctioned jurisdictions where people agree, like for instance in the case of Iran, that things are terrible, they couldn't get worse. But no, it's not any fault of ours. Absolutely, it couldn't possibly be any fault of ours. And I think this speaks to the issue of how one designs sanctions, because ultimately they're supposed to be a psychological tool. And I think it's a core principle here. Yes, they do damage, and they do a lot of damage, depending on the circumstance and what's employed. But it's damage with the intention of forcing behavior change, and that behavior really depends on whatever the problem is. It could be behavior of human rights violations, it could be behavior in terms of infiltrating another country, behavior in terms of a nuclear program, but it's trying to change core policies, behaviors, mindsets, so forth of the leadership. And one of the ways you try and do it with sanctions, right, is to bubble up resentment and difficulty from below. And you make life a little bit difficult. And then if you're also using some targeted measures, you make life difficult for the individuals responsible for the policies themselves. But the upshot is that they feel under siege. They feel like any situation other than taking the preferred policy course of the sanctioning state is a bad one, and it puts them in a worse place. It's kind of like a Chinese finger trap, that any struggle against it makes things worse. Instead, you're supposed to just relax, and then you can take your finger out. Same kind of concept is that you're trying to make the preferred outcome of the sanctioning state the only outcome that doesn't contribute to greater pain. That's the philosophy behind sanctions. And so when you're designing them, you try and come up with what are those tools? What are the things that are core vulnerabilities for the bad guys that you can affect through your own behaviors and policies? And you look for exploitable targets. In the case of Russia, for instance, our sanctions folks did a great job in identifying that Russia was heavily dependent on lines of credit coming from external sources. Great. That means you can clamp off on those. And you can clamp off on those and make a lot of pain directed at the opposition. But sometimes that doesn't work. In the case of Iran back in 2010, there was this theory that if all you did was cut off Iran's ability to import gasoline, the country shuts down because they were highly dependent on imports of gasoline. They had bad domestic refineries. We implemented sanctions here in the United States. The European Union did the same to try and take advantage of that. Iranian economy is still here, right? And we had 5 more years of trying to put pressure on it to get to a deal. The reason why is because we didn't think that they would take their crude oil, run it through petrochemical plants instead, and produce gasoline that way. It's awful, nasty gasoline that's got a lot of pollutants in it. Part of the reason probably there's respiratory problems in Iran that have gone up over the last several years. But it was an unintended consequence, an unintended development that actually, in the end, to some extent, undermine the actual impact of sanctions. So when you're doing it right, you're finding a vulnerability that you're uniquely able to exploit that the opposition is not able to repair. That's the idea. But ultimately with the sense that over time they can. Over time they can find ways around problems. Over time they can find solutions. And so this automatically leads to the need for additional sanctions. At some point, you're almost like a shark. If you're not constantly eating, constantly moving, at some point you're going to die. And sanctions regimes behave pretty much similarly because they can be defeated in so many different ways. But I think, and this is where I'll conclude, this comes back to a related issue of sanctions overreach. And I've got a lot of concerns about this in general and think that the United States is probably using sanctions too often, potentially for our long-term detriment. But I think this particularly can be the case when you take previous measures and you apply them to new circumstances and new situations. And Simone was speaking to this, and I think he's exactly right that there is a huge problem in taking Ukraine-focused Russia sanctions and now applying them for Syria reasons, or trying to double down on them for Syria reasons. This might not make a lot of sense to folks just thinking, well, you're just adding up the balance sheet and pressure. Isn't that what you're trying to do? The problem is that when you then have a resolution of Ukraine, can you relieve the sanctions? And we found this in the case of Iran, right? That we got to a resolution of the nuclear issue, which had driven so many different frantic foreign policy conversations in Washington. A lot of people said, no, we wanted to resolve everything. Well, if you try and resolve everything, at some point you can't resolve anything. And I think the greatest fear that I see in the case of the use of sanctions against Russia is this idea that they'll now be used for Syria, they'll be used for any other kind of Russian provocation that only leads you to a place where they can never come off unless Russia itself fundamentally changes. And that's nowhere to be if you're trying to have an ongoing relationship with somebody.
Yeah, I think that's just a critical point, Matt. Do you want to weigh in on Syria too?
Yeah, I mean, I'd just say, I think that, in my view, I think that it may be drawing too many connections to argue this, but I do think that there's a link between Ukraine and Syria. I think that the Russian government saw some benefit in changing the type of conversation, in part because they thought that it might have some benefits in Europe. But I think ultimately there is a lot of to what Simone was saying about the fact that it's primarily driven by a need to support Assad and to try and demonstrate, the continued relevance of Russia in the Middle East. I think that the unfortunate thing for them and the unfortunate thing for Syria, really, is I don't see Russian intervention in this regard changing the situation in a positive direction. I think that no one is willing to commit enough force to resolve the situation altogether. And what that basically means now is we just have more and more players making things more and more worse.
Right. And Bill, I was wondering if you could weigh in on what you observe in terms of changes and reforms in Ukraine over the time you've been there. Now, this is always, the big issue that looms over really any deal. Can the Ukrainian government this time round get it right? Can they take on the oligarchs? Can they introduce more transparency into the energy sector? Can they build different kinds of domestic coalitions so that they're not dependent on these kinds of extra-governmental informal networks? And in my conversation with academics and academics from different interested parties, there's really deep cynicism on this, right? As to just the extent that, one term I've heard is, virtual reform in Ukraine, right? You'll have the appearance of reform and an attempt to sort of check off and placate the West, but actually structurally it's not there. So I'd be really interested in hearing your perspective on how you view some of the progress in some of these areas.
Okay. Again, I would caution, I wasn't living there and working there, and so it's a visitor's perspective. Sure. But I sensed that there is a very serious commitment to try to make the necessary reforms. But the challenges are immense, and they realize they're immense, and we realize they're immense. But I think that there are very serious steps being taken. One example would just be changes in personnel in the ministries. I mean, there has clearly been a cleaning of house at the senior levels. And what that's led to is, instead of the officials we were dealing with looking like my parents, they were looking like my kids. And I mean, it's that big a dramatic difference of the leadership tends to be young professionals that are taking a big risk to try to help their country get through this. And you got to give them a lot of respect. And I think that they have the intelligence. As you see in, I think, almost any former Soviet area, the technical capabilities are very strong. So like the engineering for the energy systems, is first rate. But you get to the pricing mechanisms and the signals, and it's almost, it's like hopeless where you are, and to get where you need, like we come in and say, well, the best way to use less energy for the coming winter would be to raise the prices. Well, you can't raise the prices if there aren't any meters in the customers' homes. And I mean, you've got those levels of very basic challenges. And so I hope that the European Union, as they've gotten these commitments from Ukraine to move to mesh with the energy community, that they can provide the help that's needed. And I don't know how they can manage to do that with all the other demands on their resources right now. But Ukraine has made very serious and legal commitments to build into a transition. That's the second part of what we were doing there, was trying to help them plan that transition. But in the primitive state that their electric system is in, their gas production system, again, they've got the capabilities, but they need to get the access back to production and so forth. And the district heating system is just a terrible mess. And that's very important for their residential customers. So they've got big challenges. They, I think, have made serious commitments to this, and they are hoping they can make the progress. I think they're taking the steps that they can. Whether they'll be enough and be fast enough is anybody's guess. But I hope that we can all help them try to do it.
That's very interesting. Last week, when the Ukrainian President Petro Poroshenko gave his talk here at Columbia, he very much emphasized the domestic reform themes and talked about the need for young leadership to be brought in, and actually took pride in bringing in external advisors to deal with with different sectors and so forth. And it was quite a contrast to his UN speech, which was spent more criticizing Russia and the nature of the stalemate and so forth.
One little story on that. So the head of energy regulation is an extraordinarily young man. And I was very impressed. You know, I came from the utility industry, and he was speaking about the EBITDA figures and so forth. And I learned later that he had been the standout manager in President Poroshenko's chocolate business's rising young managers. And he got grabbed and put in this very responsible position. But
Interesting.
You know, that's the level of
Great.
the leaps of faith being made.
Yes, indeed. Okay, so I think this would be a good time to open it up to audience participation and questions. Since we are filming, I'm going to ask you to line up the microphone there. And if you could, for the record, just tell us your name and your affiliation and who the question is directed to. Yep.
Hi, my name is Haik Nersessian. I'm an alumni of SIPA. I have two questions, one for Mr. Simon. You mentioned that probably this year the trade between Russia and EU will be decreasing by 30%. What I'm wondering, this 30%, would it be focused on specific countries? In other words, specific countries in EU would be affected by that? And this basically follows to your point of Europe being united, basically. Would this be sustainable? Mm-hmm. And second question to Mr. Nephew. I recall last year there were some articles mentioning that Russian strategic enterprises like Rosneft, Gazprom, they had approximately $200 to $300 billion in loans, and due to sanctions they wouldn't be able to refinance them, and their reserves were approximately that much after the first collapse of oil prices. What I'm wondering is, like, what happened with those loans? Were they able to refinance it? Are they, because those loans were coming due in 2015 and 16, so how are they handling it? Thank you.
Yeah, thanks so much. Those are two really important issues. So is there a differentiated effect on Europe in terms of an economic impact? And then we'll turn to Richard on the debt.
When it comes to trade figures, actually, the effect on all EU member states is pretty much in the same territory. And so obviously it impacts differently a country which had 75 billion of trade with Russia like Germany, or a country like Malta, which had unknown, basically. You have a few exceptions. It's been interesting, for instance, to see that the British figures are showing a much lower decrease in trade this year. So I don't have a specific explanation for that. But if you take the main countries trading with Russia, the impact is pretty much unbalanced, which in a way is helpful in the sense that it doesn't make one country suffering more than the other, beyond the importance that trade with Russia had in its global trade relationships. Is it sustainable? First, we have to see if the effect is going to compound in the future. Theoretically, you could think that what was legal in 2015 may remain legal in 2016, and so the decrease that happened in 2015 will not happen in 2016 by comparison to 2015. Does that make sense? Because the companies have already integrated into their compliance policies what's possible and what is not. Having said that, and that's something we observed in the sanctions against Iran, there is also an evolution. If sanctions are perceived by the economic operators are being a long-term perspective, it has an impact on the way companies do plan for their operations. And so if in 2016 European companies perceive that sanctions against Russia may last longer than they expected to do in the first place, then you could see operations going down because of this realization. And so those figures could decrease even more. But that remains to be seen. Then you have that's the economic sustainability. You also have to consider political sustainability, but that is not about companies or banks, it's about governments. And as I said, the sustainability of sanctions will depend very much on the situation on the ground in Ukraine, and perhaps also other dynamics than we can observe on other topics like the refugee crisis. But altogether, I think we have underappreciated from the very beginning the ability of the European Union to sustain its sanctions against Russia, as we underestimated its ability to sustain sanctions against Iran. And so I would be pretty confident that if the situation didn't really change for the better, we could be politically able to sustain the sanctions.
So, I mean, your question is a very good one. It's in fact exactly what the sanctions were targeting, was the fact that unless the Russians are able to refinance their debt, they're basically going to find themselves in a much worse position, because then they have to deplete their reserves or have to default on their debt, right? That basically was the choice being presented. So no, they were not in a position to refinance that debt. They are not in a position to refinance any debt of greater than 90 days, and that's intended directly to cause it to be very difficult for them to do most international operations, and that's 90 on some transactions, even lower on others. So the reality is that sure, their reserves were going down and going down precipitously as of the spring, and in fact there are some people who estimated that their reserves could be as low as $140 billion, which is not a year's worth of imports. It's more like 4 or 5 months. I did some analysis, and I put out a piece in July that actually went through this in some detail. The issue with Russia, though, is that they also have been very effective at reducing imports when necessary, so as to smooth out any problems they had with their current account deficit. So in other words, yes, under normal circumstances, you would try and keep imports up, and so you'd have to find more money to pay for it. If you reduce your imports down a bunch, then actually you've got a lot more reserves than you thought you did in the first instance. So I think that this is a major vulnerability still for Russia. Ultimately, they need to have money, and they need to have hard currency to pay for imports. It's very difficult to conceive of them going down to zero imports. And even if they were to do that, at some point the curves are looking pretty negative for them. But I think it does mean that rumors of imminent economic collapse in Russia are probably exaggerated. Again, they always have the ability to default on some of these debts, which would have long-term repercussions in terms of their creditworthiness. But they're already a pretty poor credit risk anyway, right? So, I mean, the degree to which that's more of a problem for them is, I think, arguable. In my opinion, this remains something that can be targeted. I think that going after crude oil exports would be a way of putting more pressure on the current account. And it would also make it much more difficult for the Russians to consider cutting back on natural gas exports, because that also would contribute to the same problem. But it's not, I don't think at this point, a problem of imminent economic collapse in Moscow, if that's basically what you're aiming towards. I think they do have a little bit more longevity than that, and certainly they can even think of other options as they go into the out years if the situation were to stabilize.
Yeah, great. Let's take another question.
Good afternoon. My name is Camila Arlova. I'm not affiliated with this university. I'm just planning on coming here, going here.
Can you speak into the microphone? So
yes. Hi.
You.
Can you hear me now? Thank you for being here, and thank you for informing us on the latest. So my question is to Mr. Galbert. I read your report yesterday, which is called A Year of Sanctions, Now So What? So basically in this report you are saying, you are offering that the West should target Russia's financial sector instead of further cutting Western trade with Russia. And in the same report, however, you're saying that the overall European exports, agricultural exports, increased 6% instead of decreasing. So, and we also know that Russian public largely supports Putin. So I'm sorry, my question is very convoluted, but my question is, isn't it better to just hold this grip and let Russian people, because I know for a fact that Russian people aren't happy with this cutback on the Western trade with the fact that there is no such imports as there used to be, isn't it better to destabilize and lower Putin's image in the eyes of Russian people and see how Russian people can bring Putin to responsibility instead? Just hold the grip a little longer.
Okay, thank you.
I think the 2 points that you mentioned about the report are not fully contradictory. I think, generally speaking, I think that it will be easier for Europe if Europe was to consider further pressure and sanctions against Russia to target financial assets than trade, which affects much more trading companies. And so politically, I think it would be easier for the acceptance and sustainability of sanctions. Having said that, I don't contest the fact that when you look at what Russia has done to counter Western sanctions in adopting its own sanctions against European agricultural products, which was a way, as Richard mentioned, to limit the amount of imports to balance the broad financial situation. That Europe has been able to cope with those countermeasures by solidarity mechanisms, by help from its friends, and by exploring other markets to balance that. So on the global, from a global standpoint, the effect of those countermeasures have been limited for Europe, and I think at the end of the day more damaging for the Russians. But when you go to a microeconomic level, there has been a lot of damage because there is redistribution effects. And for instance, in France, where I come from, there has been some tough times for specific sectors within the agricultural sector. Well, that's a very specific question. But the bottom line is that I think financial is easier. Trade can be very efficient, but because it is very efficient, it is also hurting Europeans very efficiently. And one way to deal with that, I think, is for the Europeans to consider more solidarity mechanisms as the ones that were displayed to face the Russian countermeasures. And I think we Europeans should not restrain ourselves to think about solidarity mechanisms against countermeasures, but also to cope with the cost of our own sanctions. And that's about European solidarity and making sure that the sectors that are impacted by the sanctions can either reorient their activities toward other markets or be financially helped to manage what they are losing in Russian markets.
Yeah, great, thanks. Take another question.
Good afternoon. My name's Paul De La Guardia. I'm affiliated with the political risk firm Veracity Worldwide. And my question is for anyone on the panel who cares to answer. First of all, I find your arguments very compelling about advocating for further sectoral sanctions. But others who do advocate for more sanctions against Russia on Ukraine believe that sanctions targeting the individual, so I'm referring to the earlier raft of sanctions that came before the sectoral sanctions that targeted both finance and energy. They would argue that those kinds of sanctions would be more effective in forcing an outcome favorable to both Ukraine and the West. So I'd just like your thoughts on that.
Yeah,
thank you.
Thanks very much for bringing that up. That's a really important, I think, debate in the sanctions field, right, if we want to call it that, the sort of sectoral versus individual. What's your state of thinking on that now, Richard? I know the data points are few, but the individual sanctions seem to have been very much in vogue as a result of Magnitsky and some of the logic invoked there. What's your latest thinking on that?
Yeah, I mean, look, I think individual sanctions can have an impact, but it depends really on the individual circumstances. You know, if you as a person have got billions of dollars stashed in foreign bank accounts that can be easily gotten at or frozen, then targeting you via direct sanctions can be pretty effective, right? Because you can really hurt somebody directly where they are. And similarly, the United States in the past, you know, taking an Iran example, has targeted individual traders who are involved in smuggling of oil, for instance, and basically put them out of business and made it such that their company was all of a sudden insolvent and they had to sell ships. And we did some pretty hefty damage with just one little designation. So they can have an impact. What I have yet to see is an instance in which a targeted sanction imposes strategic level pressure on an economy. That's pretty hard to do. And it's because there are very few instances in which one individual is an economy and in which there is enough foreign exposure to make the action that big. There just aren't too many examples of that. A counterexample could be Gaddafi and some of the sanctions imposed against him. You know, when the Libyan civil war started, they had a dramatic impact because he had stashed a lot of money away, and so did his family. But most of the time, that's not what you're seeing. I mean, we impose designations on hundreds of Iranian officials, and with very, very few exceptions, I don't think that we managed to grab a whole lot of money as a result. So really the impact there is more in frankly, tar and feathering whoever the person is being subject to the sanction, rather than having that kind of strategic economic pressure. I think, in my opinion, targeted sanctions are very useful in terms of a public relations perspective, in trying to argue that you're not going after an economy wholesale, that you're instead trying to go after just bad guys, just bad actors, and to make it very clear that you're not trying to have broader disruptive effects. But ultimately, if you really do want to have broader disruptive effects on an economy so as to change overall regime thinking, you need to go bigger. And that doesn't mean you have to go with secondary embargoes that, you know, choke off the supply of brooms and, you know, food and medicine and so forth. There are ways in which you can deal with those issues. But you do have to put strategic effort into strategic sanctions if you want them to have a strategic impact.
Interesting. Simone, I'm really interested in hearing your perspective on this, and perhaps I could even complicate it a little bit more with an external issue. Just, you know, the whole question of sanctions violations and enforcement actions against European banks and companies, and this issue that's been emerged. I know it's also been a state issue here with DFS and some of the settlements it's announced. What's the state of thinking in Europe about the U.S. and these kinds of sanctions regimes?
Oh.
So, no. Bring it up.
Don't stop me.
Yeah, please.
First, to the questions about individual versus sectorial. I think it's very interesting to see that the way the Russia sanctions regime has been built is somehow a combination of both approaches. On Iran, we did individual designations, either for individuals or for companies, and sectoral sanctions on the side. But those were different frameworks. I think on Russia it's a little bit different because we are melting both frameworks, and when you look at how the sanctions are organized, we are targeting specific companies because of their belonging into a specific economic sector, which is this kind of a hybrid sector called sectorial sanctions, which combine both approaches. And I think that's both having targeted effects, but also an effect on the more strategic level that Richard was talking about. No, when it comes to the perception, we are laughing because we have had this conversation 150 times, I guess. Yes, I think the Europeans have mixed feelings about the outreach or the overreach, I think, of U.S. sanctions, and symbolically, this perception has been very, very strong in the cases of European banks fined in the United States for transactions that they had been carrying in contravention with U.S. primary sanctions, so the sanctions that apply to U.S. territory and U.S. persons. The problem is that in the Russia situation, although European banks haven't been facing as overreaching sanctions as they did on the Iran case, so secondary or what we call extraterritorial sanctions, many banks, I think, which have been very wary about U.S. sanctions have been very careful in the Russia case not to proceed transactions that may be a little bit borderline, but that are legal. And so I think there is an over-compliance on Russia because of what has been observed on Iran, even if legally the justification for this over-compliance is very different on Russia than it was on Iran. Broadly speaking, I think the problem that we in Europe are facing with US sanctions is the lack of transparency and understanding about what's possible and what is not. And I think the efficiency of US sanctions in turn has been built on the notion that doing business with sanctioned country was risky, even if the precise scope of the risk wasn't very clear. And this lack of transparency is about what is really targeted by US primary sanctions, what is really targeted by US secondary sanctions, and the overlap between the two. And I think because sanctions are a very important political tool that we share in Europe and in the United States, I think we need to be very careful going forward not to reduce the support for using this tool. And transatlantic cooperation on sanctions has been very successful. But I think we must tread very carefully in the overreach that Richard was mentioning earlier for that very reason. So there are probably things that both sides can do more. The Europeans can perhaps do more on the way they implement sanctions and fight against circumvention in Brussels. That is by bringing competencies more to the European level by opposition to the national level. But there are probably also things that the United States can do, either to provide more transparency to European companies or to think about ways to make life easier when it comes to secondary sanctions for their closest allies in Europe.
Oh, great, thanks. And do we have any more questions? Oh, did you want to take?
No, I actually would agree with
for the 101st time.
I think I would agree with basically everything that Simone said about what we ought to do going forward. The point I would like to make is this speaks to the issue of overuse of sanctions in terms of using them in every single situation with which we've got a foreign policy problem. And I think that needs to be reined in because if you're going to have a sanctions regime because of human rights, that's a good thing. If you're going to have a sanctions regime because of nuclear programs, that's a good thing. If you're going to have a sanctions regime because of conventional arms supply, that's a good thing. If you're going to have a sanctions regime because of cybersecurity, that's a good thing. They're all independently good things. But when you combine all of them and you basically have a U.S. economy in which you're only allowed to enter if you're willing to fulfill all U.S. foreign policy interests, I think ultimately that leads to splitting on broader international economic issues. And I think that's got some consequences. And I think, a lot of people have looked at the potential for the dollar no longer being the global reserve currency as being a symptom of this. To me, that is just a symptom. The bigger problem is if we were to see a drift away from an international economic system in which there is collaboration on the rules of the road between Europe and the United States and Europe, the United States, and other partners around the world. To me, that's the bigger issue, and I think that's the risk that we run ourselves if we make things too difficult in terms of dealing with us. I mean, I think this takes me, though, to a last point that I would make on this issue, which is, even though I'm very concerned about the possibility of overreach, I'm even more concerned about hollowing out sanctions by making them no longer terribly effective. And I think if there's one thing that we've seen over the course of the last several years, they can be really, really useful if people cooperate with them. If we make them so difficult to deal with, such that sanctions are no longer a useful tool, then you're really left with diplomacy, which has value, but may lack some spine in certain circumstances, particularly if it's not backed up with some sort of credible use of force, whatever that force may be, or military force, right? And neither of them are palatable opportunities and options here. I think if we're going to preserve sanctions as an effective way of putting pressure on people through diplomatic means, it's to our interest, I think, to be responsible in our use of them.
That's great. Well, I think that's a good place to leave things today. You gentlemen have covered such tremendous territory, both geographically and conceptually, analysis and policy. So I'd just like to thank our panelists, Bill Harriman, Senior Advisor to the Energy Secretary, Richard Nephew, Fellow and Program Director here at Center on Global Energy Policy, and Simone de Galbert, who's a visiting fellow at CSIS and also a diplomat. Thanks to all of you, and thanks to you for being here and for watching at home, and we hope to see you very soon at one of our next collaborative events. Thanks very much, guys.
Thank you.